It is a privilege to be here with you this morning, sharing what God is doing for men and women, boys and girls around the world through the Gideon ministry. And that's how my father began some 10,000 Gideon messages, maybe half of them right here in this church. My father was a longtime member of this church, as was I, and he passed away last year. And so I just wanted to start this morning by remembering him and honoring him. Thank you. Now, last week I came here to the church with my mom. I met somebody who knew my dad, but I'd never met her. And she said, "Phil, you look just like your father." And then even just this morning, I walked into church and somebody said to me, "Phil, I know you probably hear this all the time, but you sound exactly like your dad." And I've heard this before many times. People say, "I just close my eyes and I can hear and see your dad up there on the stage." My goodness, look like my dad, sound like my dad. And it just reminds me what an incredibly handsome and well-spoken man he was. All right, thank you very much. You're very kind. All right, so this morning we are going to be talking about the spiritual discipline of biblical hospitality. All right, the spiritual discipline of biblical hospitality. Now, when I say spiritual discipline, what do you think of? I think of sitting on the back porch, reading the Bible, praying, memorizing Scripture. Richard Foster calls those the inward disciplines, all right? I think of coming here to church every week, sitting in these pews. That's what we call the corporate disciplines, that with celebrations and things like that. But there's a third type of spiritual disciplines that are called the outward disciplines. And that's where biblical hospitality, service to our community comes in, all right? But what's the purpose? Why do we do these spiritual disciplines? Why do we sit on the back porch and read our Bibles? Why do we memorize Scripture? Why do you come here to church every week? My favorite definition of a spiritual discipline is this: it creates the space where God can act. A spiritual discipline opens the possibility for God to step into the space and act. When we sit on the porch and read the Bible, God can speak to us. When we memorize that Scripture, it bubbles up in that moment when it's important, and God can use it to do things. And when we act in biblical hospitality, God can use that to do His work. It creates the space where God can work. And so this morning, we're going to be looking at the two great callings of biblical hospitality and the one great promise of biblical hospitality. And for that, we're going to be looking at 2 Samuel chapter 9, the story of David and Mephibosheth. All right, so here we go. Our first great call of biblical hospitality is this: open the door. Wow, that's the hardest part, isn't it? Where we open the door, make the decision to open the door and receive the guest that God will send. All right, 2 Samuel 9, verse 1 says this: one day David asked, "Is anyone in Saul's family still alive? Anyone to whom I can show kindness for Jonathan's sake?" David was comfortable when this story begins. His kingdom was under control. Things were pretty good in his life. There's no rules that say David had to do this, all right? But God, small, still voice in David's ears says, "David, I want you to act. I want you to do something." And David obeys and opens the door to receive. And 2 Samuel 9, verse 3 goes on. David asked the question. A guy named Ziba replies, and he said, "Yes, there is a young man in Saul's family that's still alive, but he's handicapped. He's unable to walk." Verse 4 and 5 keeps going. It says, David says, "Where is this young man?" And Ziba replies, "He's in the town of Lodabar." And David says, "Bring him here. I'm ready for him to come." The first call of biblical hospitality is to open the door. The commands in the Old Testament are clear. Who are we supposed to open the door to? We open the door in the Old Testament, it's clear, the orphan, the widow, the foreigner and stranger. These are the people that were the most vulnerable in Hebrew society. God tells us to open the door to them. And when we get to the New Testament in Matthew 25, Jesus expands that list. He says, anyone who is thirsty, anyone who is hungry, anyone who's in prison, anyone we visit them, anyone who is sick, he expands that list and says, open the door to those people who are in need. Francisco and Beatriz were a couple in Costa Rica that made the decision to open their door. Their church had been invited to participate in the Casa Viva foster care ministry, and 4 ladies in the church signed up to be the church coordinators that would recruit new families. But the ladies said amongst themselves, how can we ask other families to open their door if we're not willing to open the door to our home? And so all 4 of these ladies signed up their families to be the first 4 foster families in their church. Now, foster care in Latin America and around the world is virtually unknown. And so we had to explain the concept to them. But after Francisco and Beatriz went through the family training and got certified as a family, they were ready to go. And then we heard 2 weeks later about Brandon. Brandon was 18 months old. He was in the children's hospital, and he had no one. And they called and asked if we had a family. Francisco and Beatriz said yes. But the day that we went to pick him up, Francisco was working. We went with Beatriz to the hospital. When we got into the hospital, we found something completely different. Here was this lifeless body laying in a crib, hooked up to machines. And the doctor explained the story to us. Brandon had 1 kidney that had failed completely. The other one was at 5%. Brandon was dying, the doctor said. He said he has no one to visit him, no family, no friends. There's no one coming to visit Brandon. Could Brandon come and live in your house? We don't want him to die alone. Well, what would you say? What would I say? Beatriz didn't hesitate. She said, yes, we will take him. And she explained it to Francisco later. And so they brought Brandon home to die. This lifeless body that was mostly dead already. But a funny thing happened when they got to the house. Those lifeless eyes began to track the faces in front of him. And then Brandon began to smile. Jill and I went to visit Francisco and Beatriz in their home shortly after that. And Beatriz told me, not in this house am I going to allow this child to die. This child is alive. And Francisco and Beatriz and their children literally loved Brandon back to life. Well, the doctors called it a miracle that he was still alive. He was responding so well. And Brandon grew and spent countless nights in the hospital. And the weeks turned into months, turned into years. And Brandon finally turned 5 years old, was able to be added to the National Kidney Transplant List. Wow, a miracle that God did because one couple said, yes, we're willing to open the door. The door is a wonderful image of hospitality because the door has hinges. We close the door to prepare the welcoming space, and then we open the door to receive, and then we close again to offer protection and security to the guest that comes. All right, we'll keep going. That's the first call of biblical hospitality. Open the door to give a space to engage in the significant story of salvation with our guests. All right, but we're going to move on now. We're moving to the second call of biblical hospitality. Receive the guest that God sends. The second call of biblical hospitality is this: receive the guest that God sends. Let me say it differently. We don't define the guest that God sends. God sends, we love. All right? Our tendency is the opposite. We want to put parameters around the guest. We want to define how much we're willing to get our hands dirty. We want the guest to be something or to do something or to act a certain way, but the guest arrives, warts and all. It's our call to love the one that comes. Oh, I didn't get one of the good whiz kids, we might say. All right? No, that's not it. God chooses the one that's perfect for us. 2 Samuel 9, verse 6 says this. And this is when Mephibosheth shows up in the house. He bows low to the ground, and David says, "Greetings, Mephibosheth." And I want to pause there for a minute. It's easy to love theoretically, but it's difficult to love particularly. People say, "Oh, I just love children," but it's harder to love Caleb or Maria or Brandon or Mephibosheth or the unique guest that God sends you. When David says the name Mephibosheth, his idea of loving someone from Saul's family turns from the theoretical to the particular. From the general idea of loving someone to the specific action of loving this particular young man in front of him. Particular love always comes with a name. Mephibosheth, he says. And who is this young man that God sent to David to love? All right, we get some hints from his actions and from his story. All right, we take a look at his actions here. We'll back up to that verse for 1 second. 2 Samuel 9, verse 6. The first part of it, he bows low to the ground. The ESV says he abased himself. The idea is he expressed utter unworthiness to be there. And he's literally laying prostrate in front of David. The end of that verse says, "I am your servant." That word servant in the Old Testament is the same word we use for a conquered people, a subject. It's the same word we use for a slave. He's saying, "I am your servant, I am your subject, I am your slave." When we receive the guest, we have to understand their particular story because each one of them is unique. No two of them are alike. And in Mephibosheth's case, we know something of his story. All right? At the end of 1 Samuel, we see the first part of his story. And it takes place, the end of 1 Samuel is the death of Saul and Jonathan in a great battle with the Philistines. Mephibosheth's grandfather Saul dies in that battle. His father dies in that battle. And when the news reaches the palace, the entire palace goes into a general panic. Mephibosheth's nurse grabs him up, takes off running. She trips on the carpets. He falls to the floor, lands on both of his feet, which are broken, and he's never able to walk again. And they escape into exile in the town of Lodabar. And so for Mephibosheth's entire childhood, he has heard this message. If only David had showed up at the battle, your grandfather wouldn't have died. Your father wouldn't have died. It's David's fault you're an orphan. If only David had shown up at the battle, I wouldn't have tripped and dropped you. It's David's fault you'll never walk again. If only David hadn't stolen your grandfather and your father's throne, you would be king today. It's your fault you're growing up. It's David's fault You're growing up in this town of Lo-Debar, which literally means no place, no thing, nothing. You're growing up in complete isolation. It's David's fault. Wow, and now here he is, finds himself lying prostrate in front of this same David. And where does the fear come from? Well, what happens to the family members of kings, of the old king, when there's a new king that comes? We see it time and time again in the northern kingdom, right? They kill everybody from the old family's, the old king's family to make sure that nobody has a claim to the throne. My goodness. David thinks that he is showing kindness to Mephibosheth. And Mephibosheth is laying here thinking, has he called me here to kill me? Now, I don't want to suggest that the guest you receive into your home is going to have as overlapping and complicated of a history as these two have. But I do want to say this. Every guest is unique. There are no two alike. We can make no assumptions about the person coming into our home. We need to dive in and understand their particular story, their particular past, the traumas that they've experienced, and put ourselves in their shoe to truly understand that before we can go on. All right? So David responds. Let's keep going here. Verse 7. It says, "Don't be afraid," David said. "I intend to show kindness to you because of my promise to your father Jonathan. I will give you all the property that once belonged to your grandfather Saul, and you will eat here at my table." My goodness, he shows him kindness. He gives him justice by restoring the property, and he lets him eat right there at the table. It goes on, verse 11. "And from that time on, Mephibosheth ate at the king's table like one of his own sons." It goes on, and he lets him sit at the table, and then he treats him incredibly like one of his own sons. He becomes family to David, all right? Now, this morning, we're talking about the two calls and the one great promise of biblical hospitality. We won't have time for the 4 actions of biblical hospitality. That's completely a different sermon, okay? But I am going to give you this hint. It always starts at the table. Biblical hospitality always starts at the table. And any spiritual discipline that includes food is a good spiritual discipline. You know what I'm saying? All right, so here we go. We'll go back to Mephibosheth, 2 Samuel 9, verse 8. Mephibosheth bowed respectfully. Now he's not laying prostrate. He bows respectfully and exclaims, "Who is your servant that you should show such kindness to a dead dog like me?" And now, when David finally gains his trust, all the barriers on the outside fall off. And David sees the true Mephibosheth. "I'm a dead dog," he says. "I have no future. I am a hurting person. I'm bravado and bravery on the outside, but inside, I'm filled with a broken life full of insecurities." Wow, then we get to see the true person that comes as we receive them in the name of Christ. This principle applies of not defining the guest. We don't define the guest. God sends, we love the one that comes. Applies as much to our own parenting as to any other topic. We receive this child that was made perfect in God's image into our home. It's our job to love the one that comes for the time that God allows him to be in our house. All right? We don't define the guest. God sends, we love. Martine and Rocio, Pastor Martine and Rocio, here they are. They received 3 siblings with very funny names: Ratchet, Slots, and Montserrat. All right? They came into their house, and they were wild children out of an extremely difficult situation in their past. They lived in very, very difficult situations with a drug-addicted mother, and literally, Ratchet had to crawl out of the window of the locked house to beg for food for his little siblings. And he ended up with Pastor Martine and Rocio, And the first day, that first night, they got up to the house. It had been a day of all kinds of logistics. And they took the food out and making the plates. They set the plates on the table. They were finishing things up. And they turned around and looked. And here were all three children. They'd taken their plates off the table, had squatted down, and were eating the food as if they would never eat again. And all of the family, Pastor Martin and Rocio, their 4 children, just stopped and looked at them. What do? Pastor Martin walks over, he grabs his plate, he walks over to the corner, and he slides down the wall onto the floor with the kids, and he eats his meal with the kids on the floor. All of his family grabs their plates, and they ate their meal sitting on the floor right next to the kitchen table. Wow, we don't define the guest. God sends, we love them right where they're at, right from that point. All right, so we're going to keep moving. Here we go. Our third point this morning, the great call or the great promise of biblical hospitality. We've talked about opening the door. We've talked about receiving the guests that God sends. Now it's time to look at the great promise of biblical hospitality, and this is it. Jesus promises to show up. All right? Jesus promises to show up. If I told you that you could welcome Jesus into your house, would you do it? Let's look at this promise. Matthew 18, verse 5 says this: anyone who welcomes a little child like this on my behalf is welcoming me. This is Jesus speaking. He says, you're welcoming me. Now it's interesting. Let's look at that. This is not some kind of metaphor. He doesn't say, anyone who welcomes a little child like this on my behalf is like welcoming me. No, there's no word like in there. It's not a metaphor. He doesn't say, this is some kind of celestial bank account. If you welcome a child like that in my name, I'll write it in my little book in heaven as if you received me. No, he says, that's me. All right, what's your image of Jesus look like? Do you guys have an image of what Jesus looks like? All right, I think back to my grandparents' church in Nebraska, had a big picture up on the wall. It's night in a garden. Jesus is holding a lantern, ready to knock on a door. And his hair is flowing. The lighting is perfect. What's your image of Jesus? Does he look like the guy maybe in the Jesus film or maybe The Chosen? All right, Jesus says this. He said, if you want to know what I look like, look in the eyes of a vulnerable child, because that's me. That is me. Matthew 25, he goes on, look in the eyes of the sick and the hungry and the thirsty and the prisoners. That's me. He says, I'm there. Jesus promises to show up, but in the same way that we don't get to define the guest Jesus sends, God sends, we love the one that comes, we don't get to define how Jesus shows up. We want it all to be pretty roses and that type of thing, but Jesus comes. He promises to show up. All right, but here, I'll tell you a story that we've got. Miguel was 6 years old when he was abandoned on the streets of Costa Rica. And his uncle and aunt had come to Costa Rica from Nicaragua to another country looking for a better life. They didn't find that life. They eventually ended up abandoning Miguel on the streets of Costa Rica. He ended up with one of our families, Marco and Jadira. Now, they loved, and here they are on the screen, they loved Miguel, and Miguel loved them. They had a wonderful, beautiful relationship. And he was there for over a year. Jadira and Marco were very involved in their church, took him to church. He developed a young faith, and every night they would pray for him before he went to bed. A year later, after he came to live with them, Miguel asked Jadira one night, can I pray that can I pray that my mother would come and find me? And Jadira said, absolutely. You can pray that your mother would come and find you. And so every night they started praying that Miguel's mother would come and find him. Now, when our staff member heard about what was happened, they were dismayed. Oh my goodness, she came back to the office and told us the story, and we were all dismayed because we know the statistics. We know that children from one country who get abandoned in another country on the streets in that city rarely or never find their biological family. We thought, how can we allow Miguel to pray a prayer like this that's impossible? What will it do for his young faith to be praying an impossible prayer? And so we were debating about how are we going to respond to this? What's the right response? And just then the telephone rang. Phil, it's for you, they said. So I went into my office, got the phone. Hello? And this guy says, hi, is this Casa Viva? Yes, it is. Well, I'm the ambassador from Nicaragua to Costa Rica. And I'm calling because do you have a boy named Miguel? His mother is looking for him. And I thought, my goodness, I don't have faith for that kind of thing to happen. God allows it to happen. It's not something that I can do. Let's go back to the David and Mephibosheth story for 1 second and try and get that wrapped up, all right? The funny thing about the David and Mephibosheth story is we don't know how it turns out. We don't know how it ends. And the interesting thing is, the Bible gives us two endings that are completely different. All right? In the first ending, found in 2 Samuel 13, it's during Absalom's rebellion. David is fleeing town. Ziba shows up, the same Ziba from earlier. And he says, he shows up with food and all this kind of stuff. David says, where's Mephibosheth? And Ziba says, well, he stayed back in Jerusalem because he said, today's the day I'm going to get my father's throne back. All right, so that's the first story. The second story takes place 2 years later when David is coming back. And when he gets back, he finds Mephibosheth. Mephibosheth is one of the first guys to greet him. And he says, Mephibosheth, why didn't you go with me into hiding? And he says, or flee when Absalom took over the kingdom. And Mephibosheth says, I tried to come, but I'm crippled. When I came down the stairs, I couldn't make it to the bottom steps in time, and Ziba had already left me. I was faithful to you and loyal to you this whole time. All right? Two totally different stories. In one, Mephibosheth is a backstabbing traitor. In the other, he's a faithful and loyal son. So which one is true? Which one of those stories actually took place? The Bible never tells us. And we never find out. Scholars debate about which one of the two stories is actually true. But the point is, it doesn't matter. Because this story is not about Mephibosheth. This story is about David. All right? Maybe the better question is, did it matter? Did all this work that David had done matter? He had brought him in. He treated him like his own son. But it didn't matter. It doesn't matter how it turns out, the story, because God called David to do something, and David responded. God's small, still voice said to David, open the door. And David opened the door. He obeys. God's voice says, receive the guest I sent you, unique and particular. And David receives the guest that comes. God says, I want you to not love from afar. Don't just send money. I want you to get your hands dirty. I want you invite him to come into your house and to sit at your table. And David obeys. At the end of the day, this story is about what God wanted to do in David's life. not about what he wanted to do in someone else's life. That's a different story. All right? Jesus promises to show up, but in the same way, we can't define the guest. We don't define the way that Jesus shows up. And I want to go back to our story of Francisco and Beatriz and little Brandon on the list for the kidney transport. Well, Brandon grew and grew and grew. They learned how to do dialysis in the house every night and were taking care of him. And finally, 8 years later, Brandon was 9 years old. He'd been waiting for that kidney for years. And on Christmas Eve last year, we got the call. There was a kidney for Brandon. Well, then it was a flurry of calls and of prayer chains and logistics, and then the big surgery. Brandon goes into ICU, and we wait to hear. And we wait, and we wait, and we wait, and then we got the call. The kidney had failed, and Brandon would die within weeks. In March, I spoke at the funeral, and we talked to Beatriz. And she said, when we got that first call, it was literally the happiest moment of my life. And we got that second call, it was the saddest moment of my life. She said, we had been telling Brandon about all the things that he would get to do with his new kidney, play soccer and go swimming. And we had to change all that and tell him about all the wonderful things he would get to do in heaven. She said it had been an incredibly different time. It's all right. I did speak at the funeral, and I was amazed to look out and see the church absolutely filled with people who had been impacted by Brandon's life. They literally filled the seats, 300 seats. They were standing in the back and spilling out into the street beyond. And I realized the doctor's words were prophetic. We don't want Brandon to die alone. Brandon did not die alone. He died surrounded by family, surrounded by friends, and in the arms of Beatriz, his mother, who was embracing him when he died. God took him home. Jesus promises to show up, not always in the way that we can define, but Jesus was present. I'll give you five quick thoughts to close, and we'll wrap this up. All right, here you go. Number one, be hospitable. The Bible does not say do hospitality. The Bible says be hospitable. It's identity. It is who we are as Christians. Number two, you are Christ to the guest. Whenever you open your door, especially to your own home, and allow that guest to cross the private threshold of your own home, know that you are Christ for that guest. Whenever you are serving in the community, know that you are Christ to that guest. Number three, create the space where God can act. That's where we started, remember? This is a spiritual discipline. We don't do this hospitality to receive something in return. We do this to create the space where God can do what he wants to do in the life of the guest, but also in our lives. Number four, testify to how Jesus is showing up. Jesus will show up. He promises to. So pay attention and watch. And when you see him show up, testify to what God is doing. And finally, remember, you are the guest. Remember when you were the one standing out in the cold? You were the one who had no future and no hope. And God opened his door and let you come in and sit at his table. Let you be treated as his sons. More than that, let you be adopted as his sons and daughters. It turns out God doesn't need us to do something for him. God wants to do something in us. So open the door, receive the guest, know that Jesus is going to show up, and be hospitable because you desperately need Jesus in your life. Thank you.